All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And thank you all for joining us this morning. So today we are doing something that doesn't always happen in the lectionary covering Genesis, and that is we're going from one chapter to the next. We've been jumping around a lot, sometimes multiple chapters, sometimes one or two, but this week the lectionary leads us right from chapter 28 to chapter 29. And so today's story is the story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, and Laban. And I think one thing that's interesting to start with before we read the section is to think about the contrast between last week's story, which was by and large the theophany, the appearance of God to Jacob and Jacob's dream at Bethel. And so this is a very holy, sacred moment. It's full of symbolism. And then we transition immediately from that into the story today, which is more or less kind of like a soap opera. It's full of drama and intrigue. There's elements of humor, elements of deception. And so there's a marked contrast between 28 and 29. And so I want you to think about that and why is that happening in this story? How can we go from this high moment as far as in a religious context to this seemingly low moment? Not to dismiss marriage as a low moment, but to contrast that as the kind of cultic or sacred element of chapter 28 to this kind of deception and almost outright comedy that's happening in 29. I want to think through those things because I think that encapsulates in a way who Jacob is. So think about that both as the story, but also what is it saying about this person of Jacob. So we're going to read as we have the entire chapter. And Aaron, if you would, could you read 1 through 14? And then Allison Kelly, would you be up for reading 15 through 20? And then let's see, Nicole, would you read 21 through 35? All right, thank y'all all. Aaron, whenever you're ready.
Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the field with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We're from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said, "and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." "Look," he said, "the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to the pasture." "We can't," they replied, "until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah, so she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home, and there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood."
Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, you should therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel? And Laban said, It is better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love that he had for her.
Then Jacob said to Laban, Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. So Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah, and Jacob said to Laban, What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? Laban said, It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to wife. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, Because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and says, Because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son, and said, Now this time my husband will be joined to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, This time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So there's a lot going on in this story, but by and large, the chapter as a whole is a pretty much a singular passage. There's a kind of break at verse 14, but by and large, we are one story. If you remember last week, there was a lot going on in the chapter. One thing to point out from chapter 28 is right at the beginning of 28, the first and second verse, Isaac, after Jacob has deceived him and taken his brother's blessing, he says, You are not to take a woman from the Canaanites, but go to Paddan Aram and take someone from your mother's brother Laban's one of his daughters for your spouse. And so we have this kind of wandering Jacob who's simultaneously fleeing his brother Esau and looking for a wife. So there's this theme of exile throughout. So he's fleeing, and he's also trying to kind of fulfill this promise his father has put upon him. I'm having the hardest time keeping all these names straight. I was writing the notes this week, and I just kept I need to have like a flow chart of all this. It's like ingrained deeply in my mind, but there's so much interconnection between the families. So it's always funny to kind of pull out of your head which person we're talking about and the relationship to these other people, which sometimes can be twofold. So anyhow, Jacob goes to a well, and one of the first things we learn about this well is there's this giant rock blocking it that takes multiple shepherds to remove. And so Jacob's there, and he starts talking to these shepherds, and you'll have to listen to the amount of times words of kinship come up. Brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers. That's a huge theme in this passage. It's that onus of responsibility that was placed on Abraham's servant when he went looking for a wife for Isaac. And now it's Isaac's kind of impetus towards Jacob when he goes and finds a wife. And remember, Esau doesn't take a wife from the family, and so it's kind of considered separate. It's considered a separate nation. It's kind of pulled himself off. At one point, he does that to kind of spite his father. So this theme of kinship is really important here. This is also really weird, right? This is outlawed today, to marry your first cousin. right? It's not a healthy thing. I mean, the doctors in the audience could tell us about the issues with incest, but this was the time period, and that's how things were, and it was extremely important to keep this kind of relationship going. So there's this passage where Jacob's at the well, and he's kind of shooting the breeze with these shepherds. You know, do you guys know this this guy Laban? And he says, how is it with him? And they say yes. And right then, just as Rebecca showed up a few chapters ago, Rachel shows up. And when Rachel shows up, Jacob just puts it on real thick here. I mean, this you have to kind of read this and think through beyond just what the text is putting. There's a lot of humor here, right? So Rachel says, in verse 7, Jacob says, look, it is still broad daylight. It is not time for the animals to be gathered together. Water the sheep, go and pasture them. Like, hey, get out of here. I'm going to hit on this girl right here. So, you know, go away, get on. So already we're getting some humor. But the shepherds are kind of like, what are you talking about? We got to wait till all the flock gets here. So while they're speaking, in verse 10, it says, now when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his mother's brother Laban, and the sheep of his mother's brother Laban, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of his mother's brother Laban. So here's this giant stone that takes multiple shepherds to move, and Jacob, either in his strength or his just sheer determination to impress this woman, just pulls the rock off. So this is humorous, but there's also this element of kinship. You see his mother's brother Laban 3 times in one verse. It's like, oh, did you get it? Oh, you didn't? Here's it again. Oh, you didn't get it the second time? Boom, a third time. So the narrator is just hitting us over the head, literally, with this to let us know that this is okay. I was thinking about this, like, was there ever a point in time where someone was like, there was questions around Jacob and his marriage? Because it's like this passage just really drives it home, this element of kinship. That's just speculation on my part, but I just wanted to point out like how just overemphasized it is here. So then there's this really kind of strange part in verse 11 where it says, and Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. I think what the passage is pointing out here, and we have to remember this passage is 14 years long or more in just a few verses. And so a lot is happening quickly. And so what I think you have here is him kissing her and weeping out loud is this symbolism of him being joyed, him completing this kind of familial mission, him finding kinship and finding love and being attracted to her. So like that's all pulled together in this one little verse. And then Laban hears about this, and Laban is overjoyed. We remember from when Laban first appeared, he kind of was wagering, right, over his sister Rebecca, and we got this kind of sense that he saw the jewelry that Abraham's servant had, and that was what kind of made him light up. And so there's this kind of foreshadowing of the figure of who Laban was. But for now, Laban seems like a genuine, caring guy. He's happy, and he says this in verse 14, surely you are my bone and my flesh. Bible trivia, what does Adam say to Eve in chapter 2 right after she is made out of his rib? Does anyone want to answer?
She says the same thing.
Yep. In chapter 2, verse 23, then the man said, Adam, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. This occurs again, I think in 2 Samuel, this phrase, but it entails an intimacy of relationship. And so what we get here is that relationship, that kinship, again pointed out. It's also interesting to think through how Laban is portrayed right here. So Jacob sees Rachel, he likes Rachel, he wants to marry Rachel, and him and Laban make a deal. It's supposed, Jacob doesn't have anything to offer monetarily or materially, so he becomes kind of an indentured servant of sorts to kind of pay what was called the bride price. So verse 17 is one that I'm interested to see how translators translate it. The NRSV reads, Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. The word lovely, the Hebrew is like rach, it's R-A-K-H basically, and it doesn't mean lovely. It means weak or tender. And so you'll see throughout the Old Testament in different uses, either weak or frightened or fearful, or tender as in tender-hearted. So it's really hard to discern, is this a positive attribute of Leah or is it a negative attribute of Leah? Did she have seeing problems, or did she have, I think Robert Alter translates it, sweet eyes. Does anyone have anything different besides lovely as the NRSV translates it?
Alter has tender.
New English has dull-eyed.
Mm.
You got it on?
Yeah.
The Living Bible says nice eyes.
Nice. Okay. Weak, dull, tender. So there's no way to figure here, because if you do a word study on this, it can appear in kind of both positive and negative ways. And so I think one thing that also adds to the problem of this verse is the conjunction and can be translated just as equally but. So it could say Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Or it could say Leah's eyes were tender and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Yes.
My translation, I couldn't find my unmute, says there was no sparkle in Leah's eyes, but Rachel was shapely and beautiful. That's,
yeah.
What's the name? Jerusalem.
Jerusalem Bible.
So yeah, there's but in there in this one.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the NASB has but as well, and they translated it weak. And NASB is probably one of the most literal translations out there. All that to say is that we can't know for certain, what kind of use is being used here, positive or negative. I think the way the story plays out, we get this sense that obviously Jacob likes Rachel more. And so when I see it, I think of it as the usage of weak because of how the story plays out. But I just want to lift up, you can't really say, it's very ambiguous in many ways.
Will.
Yes.
New King James Version, or the English Standard Version, says Leah's eyes were weak.
Yeah.
But Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so you're seeing even amongst the versions just we're reading in this class, there's variations on it, and some of them contrast with each other. You see the NRSV kind of going beyond a literal translation with lovely, but I mean, I think if you have a translation that's using tender or weak, that's pretty straight on. But I don't want to get caught up in the translation as much as to show that there is a contrast being made between these two, right? And what happens with Jacob over and over again? He's in conflict. He begins his conflict from in the womb. Remember the oracle that his mother received? There are 2 children within you, and the elder shall serve the younger. And so Walter Brueggemann calls Jacob this character of conflict, this man of conflict. And so I think that's what's happening here as well, is not only is he in conflict with his brother, his blood kin, but he becomes in conflict essentially with his 2 wives. And so he's constantly in conflict with people. So we get this famous trickery on Laban's part, right? Jacob works for 7 years. There's a big wedding feast. And then they go into the bridegroom's room, and the next morning he wakes up and discovers it's not Rachel as he had thought and essentially agreed with Laban for, but it's Leah. there's so much mystery behind what's going on here. Was Leah forced into this? Why didn't Leah say anything before the morning? How did Jacob not know this? Was Laban tricking him in a deceitful way, or was he doing what was right? Because you'll see later, if you look at verse 26, Laban says, "This is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn." All of this is going on. There are scholars of the ancient Mideast or the ancient Near East, and they speak about the veil that women would wear before getting married. If you remember when Rebecca falls off her camel or donkey, and when she sees Isaac, she veils herself right after that. And so there's this sense that maybe he never really knew what they looked like because of the veil, or on the wedding night because of the veil. This is all speculative. We also have to remember that this is a story, and there's a literary element to it. I think the important point to point out here, though, is that conflict, right? Jacob is constantly in conflict, and he's constantly coming up against conflict. He's also the trickster, right? And in this time, he's been tricked. He's been duped. And so since the early rabbis commented on this text all the way up into the Middle Ages with Christian commentators, this has been seen as a form of poetic justice. This trickster who has stolen birthright and blessing is finally tricked himself. And what makes this all kind of ring out together is I want you to listen to these words. The word for firstborn in Hebrew is bek hira. The word for birthright is bek korah. The word for blessing is berakah. So you're hearing over and over again these similar sounding words that all tie into the person of Jacob, right? This trickster who has stolen his bekarah and berakah, but is duped into marrying the firstborn, the bekhera. So I can't speak to the level of literary devices that are going on in this story. There's numerous ones. There's ones I haven't pointed out. Like if you look at verse 12, here's another one. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. Remember, what does Rebekah do? She runs. She goes with haste. So it's drawing these allusions to earlier stories constantly throughout this. Or you can think of the well and Isaac, this Abraham's servant meeting Rebekah. There's all these connections here. And I think one of the most central of this text is the linguistic similarities between birthright, blessing, and firstborn, and how that kind of, you can center Jacob into that and all the conflict that comes up through his life, and in many ways dictates his life, right? A large portion of his story is the contentious relationship he has with Esau, and then him fleeing Esau, and then ultimately meeting Esau. And then there's the conflict between his two wives and the way that plays out with their children's birth. The other thing I wanted to point out about this passage, I'm not going to get into the details about the trickery and deception. I think we're all familiar enough with that story about what happens. The last thing I want to point out, though, or second to last, is verse 30. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. He served Laban for another 7 years. Just like his father before him, he deeply loves one of his wives, right? Isaac loved Rebekah, and Jacob loves Rachel. This story is very kind of domestic. There's not anything theological here. There's not anything theological for all the verses preceding this. This story does not mention God once, and yet we go to the next verse, verse 31, and it says, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. This is the first time that God's mentioned in this passage. I would say this passage is very much just a kind of ancestral tale, and yet we get this point here right at the end where a theological element kind of comes into it. I'm really interested to hear what y'all's thoughts are on this, and I want to lay this out too by saying when this book was written, all children were seen as a blessing, and barrenness was seen as a contrast to blessing, right? So this isn't how we see the world today, but as they saw it then, women who gave birth were blessed by God, and women who were barren weren't. That's just the way it was. That's not right. That's just the cultural way it was then. And so when you see it saying the Lord saw that that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. There's two things I want to point out. It could just as easily be the narrator saying, well, Leah was blessed by God because she had children, and Rachel wasn't because she didn't have children. The second thing is the text does not say, at least here, that God is preventing Rachel from having children, right? So if you remember Sarah or Rebecca, they were just barren, right? That was just a biological reality. And yet God worked through them and overcame that biological reality. So I want to point out there's a lot of complexity happening in this seemingly simplistic and straightforward verse. And that's kind of our work as readers today and interpreters to think through what is going on here and what are the different levels to this, because it's not just as straightforward as the verse reads out. As most of y'all know, Rachel will go on to have children again. And so there is this theme again and again and again of God bringing life where there is none, or God bringing abundance out of scarcity. And so we're seeing a kind of a contention here between these two women, these two sisters, and scarcity in life and abundance and the lack of it. And then lastly, Leah names the children. I read one commentator that said, just like his father, Isaac, Jacob becomes this kind of passive figure because the woman is naming the children here, and it seems to be that Jacob's behind the scenes. I don't necessarily agree with that because Isaac doesn't really play any role throughout the story. He's always in the background, more or less. Jacob is at the forefront again and again. And so I think what you're seeing here is not a passive Jacob, but rather a hurting Leah. Leah is hurting because she's been cast off. She's been cast aside. And she articulates that hurt through the naming of her children. And she articulates her hope for what the marriage could be. The children's names, right? Reuben means roughly, see, a son. It's like she's trying to get her husband's attention. Simeon's name is very close in Hebrew to Shema, which is the famous passage from Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, and so it means hear, like hear with ears. And then Levi is joined, which is kind of the most devastating. I will finally be joined to my husband. And then Judah is praised. She's giving thanks. And these births happen one after the other in the story. That's a quick walkthrough of what's going on here. This chapter, for me, deeply contrasts to chapter before. There's this theophany. God is extremely present. There's this vision, this dream. There's this sacred place and the hoisting of that pillar. And then we get into this story, which is much more kind of a novel, a drama, soap opera. There's humor, there's intrigue, there's mystery, there's trickery, there's deceit. And God just shows up essentially in one verse. So that's the thing I've been wrestling with the most is what is the theological message of this passage? And how does the theology kind of show itself in the everydayness here? Because remember, one of the things with Jacob is not an upright and blameless figure like his grandfather Abraham. He's a trickster. He's deceivious, deceitful, and yet the patriarchal lineage of Israel comes through him. And if we remember, in a couple chapters, chapter 32. He becomes Israel, and his 12 children are the 12 tribes. And so he's a seminal figure in the story of Israel, and yet he's this just kind of regular, good and bad person. I'll leave it there. What questions, thoughts, reflections do y'all have? I was reading Allison Kelly's comment, delicate, and I'm guessing that was for the eyes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
It's a New King James Version. That's Leah's eye. The thing that's of interest to me, and I would be interested in hearing what some other people think about it, is you look at these lines, these two little things that describe the women, like it only describe, it's like Oscar Wilde wrote it, Leah's eyes are what? She's got a good personality. You might as well have said that. And then Rachel is beautiful, etc. So that sort of sets up what's going to happen, because we really don't know. And let's assume that we haven't read any further than that. So you get the description of these two gals, and you wonder, wow, that's weird. You know, boy, that's a big difference. What are they trying to tell us? And then you get, it's like a comedy, really. And then you get, the story goes on, and you get, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Here's Leah is going to fulfill most of the prophecy that the 12 tribes of Israel, while Rachel is barren. So it's really a change. It's like they've set up something where Leah looks like, gee, that's not a real good description, weak eyes or whatever. And then Rachel, and then the next thing you know, you're reading about who's having the children that are fulfilling the prophecy. So it's really strange. It's mysterious in a way. Why is that set up like that? I don't know really, but it seems strange to lead into the story like that. That's what I have. I wonder what some other people think.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll leave that open to other folks to answer. I think this story is definitely kind of there's just a lot of like mystery behind it. It on one level it's very just kind of straightforward. It's humorous at the beginning, then there's the kind of poetic justice or the tricking of the trickster, and then the contentiousness between the sisters, centered upon how Jacob treats them or his affection toward them. And yet there's a complexity beneath it, I think you're pointing out. Anyone else want to respond to Martin or have questions or thoughts on this passage? Faye?
Okay. I'm bothered from the feminist perspective or the female perspective, or I'm just going to throw it out there. So Jacob had some issues, but he didn't mind sleeping with all these women that just showed up in his tent, or he showed up in their tent. And so, plus these women are giving these men their handmaids at the same time. So this guy is sleeping around, in my opinion. And I know it's a morality, but he might have loved Rachel, but he had no trouble sleeping with Leah. So Leah doesn't feel loved, but he's still having sex with her. And then he has sex with her handmaid, and then he has sex with his second wife, and he has sex with his, I mean, this guy, I don't know, it's a different kind of morality that we have these days. And anybody in my tent I sleep with, and I kind of like one better than other, but I'm not discreet about those options. So, and why are these women always giving away their handmaidens? The same as the stories before that. Was it like just, did you see that? Like, he married and then out comes another maid with her, and they married and another maid comes with her. So that's my thought about that. And this whole thing could have been cleaned up if Abraham had just told Sarah, no, he didn't want to sleep around. And so I've got this whole thing that some of these men could have made better choices. It would have shortened the Old Testament, but there was a way to sort of make these right. So you can speak to the microphone, Dr. Will, and tell me why this guy gets away with this kind of stuff. And I really hate when women are put on, merited by whether they can have children or not. And poor women for all these histories, right? Including women that get their heads cut off because they can't have children. So that's my speak about that. I know I've had a lot of coffee. Maybe I should switch to wine before I talk to you guys next time.
Thank you, Faye. Before I answer that, Kelly typed in the comments, Rebecca's name in Hebrew is Rivka. And so there is a similarity, but it's not Rebecca it's not pronounced that way in Hebrew. So I would say it sounds more like it in the English than in the Hebrew. Faye, your question well, I guess I should say your statement
Yeah.
is a good one, and is one that folks have wrestled with, especially in the last 100 years, as women have gained more rights in society. I think that's the contrast we come up again and again as we read the Old Testament, right? Is how could these people do that? And I want to point out, though, that contrast, that conflict is happening to early readers of the scriptures as well as within the scripture itself. So the marriage of a man to a woman's sister was outlawed in in Leviticus 18. I think it's actually Leviticus 18:18. So you're seeing even within the Bible, there is this changing morality and this constant. I guess the best way to put it is morality is dynamic throughout Scripture, and so even when we get to, I mean, there's people that are just obsessive and adore Paul, and yet there's parts of Paul that make them cringe, right? And so you kind of have to have that recognition that there is cultural baggage and moral issues throughout Scripture, and it's our work as readers and as Christians to kind of discern where is the cultural baggage and where is the theological, spiritual emphasis and richness that we are seeking out. And I think the church, especially in the last 100 years, the last 70 years, has deeply read a much more feminist reading of these passages, right? This isn't right. This is wrong. Leah has been discarded. I mean, Abraham and Hagar is another example of this handmaid. And so that's just kind of the story we're given. And what we have to do is discern where is God at work in all of this. And all of this is largely a mess, right? It's just a mess. All of the interrelationships, all the way people are treated. And I that's why I love the Hagar story so much, because of how Abraham treats her and how Sarah treats her. Sarah's awful to Hagar. And yet God cares for Hagar. God cares for Ishmael, and God makes a great nation. It says it in our Bible, a great nation out of Ishmael. And so I think that's a really good example of that kind of cultural conflicting with the theological. And I don't want to make it seem like this is an easy thing to discern, because it's always a mess, right? It's always kind of jumbled up together. So, but I think it's important to point those things out. This isn't something we stand for, right? What is it in Timothy where it says women shouldn't speak in church? Well, we don't listen to that at all, thank goodness, right? And so, it's doing that work of discernment. And I think it's great that even in the Bible's conflicting with itself, right? Because this is against what happens in Leviticus just a couple books later. And so you're seeing there the working out of a community in relationship with God and trying to discern where God is among them and where God is not.
Will?
Yes.
I'm interested in this idea that Leah is neglected, that Yahweh says that she's neglected. Mm-hmm. It seems to me there's ample evidence that she is not neglected. She has children. He slept with her right away, and so on and so forth. Obviously, there's some implication that Jacob doesn't love her, but he doesn't say that. He says it indirectly, that why did you trick me? But there's very little evidence that Leah is really neglected and that God should favor her, except for this idea that she isn't loved. He doesn't say he doesn't love her. He doesn't say take her away or anything like that.
Yeah, I would disagree with you there, Dave. And I think the reason I would disagree is the text says twice that Rachel is loved, and it never says that Leah was loved. He sleeps with her on their wedding night thinking that it is Rachel. He doesn't do it because he's knowingly sleeping with Leah, and he's disappointed, right? He goes to Laban's like, why'd you do this? And then he fights for Rachel for another 7 years because that's who he ultimately wants. And then the birth happens after God sees that she was despised. And the text, the Hebrew there, the NRSV translates it as unloved, but the Hebrew is more despised or hated. And so I think that shows good and well how she was treated, right? She was despised, and who is she despised by? Her husband, Jacob. And then it says in verse 20 and 32, Leah conceived and bore a son, and she named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked on my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. So the husband doesn't love her, and she's afflicted. So I would, that's why I would disagree with you on that point.
Well, as the other person said, the morality here is a little bit interesting because he keeps going back to her and impregnating her over and over, despite the fact that he despises her.
Yeah. Well,
with her.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, women were treated as property in this day and age, and their worth was seen in if they could have children or not. So, yeah. Thanks.
Will?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
As a male, I hesitate to get into this, but I will anyway.
That sounds like a very male thing to say.
What Faye said. What strikes me in this is, and compared to the current time, it makes me wonder if we've really made a lot of progress. Quick backstory. About a decade ago, I read an article by a male economist who was talking about the influence of culture on the economy. And one of his examples was, and maybe he meant to be a little humorous, he said if on a given morning, every woman in America woke up and decided no longer to use makeup and to worry about her hairstyle, the American economy would totally collapse. Now, meaning that the power of culture and women's concern about their appearance. It's interesting in this story that the women's physical appearance is commented on, not Jacob's. And not being political, but I was struck during Obama's administration that when he and Michelle appeared, almost inevitably there'd be a couple of paragraphs about what Michelle was wearing and her hairstyle, and not a word about Barack's appearance. So I sometimes wonder, and I'm not being critical of women, I don't intend it that way, but have we really made a lot of progress? And that may have nothing to do with this study. One other thing on a different pathway, and again, a quick backstory. For a number of years during my ministry, I was active in my church in ministry to homeless families, primarily through a program called Family Promise. One of the dynamics we kept dealing with was at times, we call them guests, not clients. A guest would be deceptive. In some cases, deceptive in a government program, which created some legal, potential criminal implications. So one of our challenges was to say to people, you're better off being truthful with us. We're better able to help you. If you deceive us or lie, you make things more difficult. So there's this tension between, and Brueggemann really stresses this, it seems to me, in his commentary, that in spite of all this deceptiveness, God is at work. Okay, I get that, but there's still a little unease within me. Do we take this story to say it's okay to be deceptive? God will make it okay in the end. I don't have an answer to that, but anyway.
Yeah, I think in regards to your first point, I mean, I can't speak as a woman, obviously, but I think it's both in, right? We are in a better place, and we are by no means in a place of equality. And that's the continuous work of the church, is to do better and not to get drawn in by ideas of utopia as if we've arrived. I think that's the impetus upon us, is God is greater than us. God is beyond us. And so we never arrive to what God wants. We're always seeking after that. The second part, I think, is a really good point to bring up for this passage and the character of Jacob. And I think this is something that we don't talk enough about David with either, is there are traits we would hate to have in our children or someone that was marrying our children, right? Someone that was part of our family. They're just deceitful. I mean, what David does with Bathsheba's husband is just awful. It's just terrible. And yet these are the people whose names we remember and who we talk about. And so I think I don't have an answer on this other than like God is working through broken people. And as Reformed folks, we don't believe anyone's perfect, right? That there's that idea of total depravity, which I think gets turned into a black or white. You're either depraved or you're not depraved. And I think total depravity looks like no one's perfect. And so we both have these elements of, for lack of a better term, good and bad within us. But I think what the stories in Genesis are pushing us towards is kind of breaking the clay feet of our idols and bringing them down to our level and making us think through where is the good and where is God at work in these people and where is God absent or not at work in these people? And what does that say to us? And what does that call us to as people of faith, as disciples? Thanks. I saw Sarah and then Faye.
So I'm struck by how one-dimensional these people seem to be and how the story's being told. And, you know, I did read The Red Tent, and I was very grateful for that much broader fictional telling of the relationship between these sisters and their maids and Jacob. I agree with Faye. Jacob seems to be a despicable kind of a character. I also, I think that maybe the description we have of Leah may be slightly underhanded. For disregard that Laban seems to have, his sister Rebecca was much more a grab you by the throat kind of character than he seems to have raised daughters to be. So I'm a little concerned, or I should say confused, on how does a family produce a Rebecca and the same family produce a Leah and a Rachel that are so passive in their commitment to the future. So I liked the way the Red Tent told the story, because Leah is much more invested in her own future and stakes her claim and says, okay, I may not be the first wife, the beloved wife, the one that's cherished, but I'm going to contribute to this family. I'm going to earn my place here. And I thought that it told the story differently for Rachel as well, because she becomes the midwife for everybody's birthings. And so she can't have a child herself, but she welcomes every child as a gift from God, which I thought was a better, it made me feel much more comfortable with the story, because it made sense, where the relationship between these two sisters seems to be so frictional, so broken, that it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, so that's a lot, and I think those are all good points to bring up. I think with Jacob, as we distance ourselves from the morals he adheres to, we also have to remember that this was not uncommon in his time. And so the behavior of marrying multiple women and sleeping with handmaids is despicable to us, and it's something we distance ourselves from, but it's a very common thing in that day and age. And so that's the moral complexity we have to deal with. I don't think that means that we have to say that Jacob's not despicable. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we have to kind of pull in all the complexities of this. I think I would disagree with you that Rachel and Leah are passive. I see Leah as, at least as the text portrays her right at the end, as a person of agency. She's naming her children. She's evoking the emotions she's feeling, She's crying out for the hopes she has for her relationship. And so she might not be, and I would agree with you, she's not as active as Rebecca is portrayed. But I do think that there's an element to Leah that we often miss here at the end, because this story happens so quick, but that Leah does have agency. Leah does have personhood, and she's kind of showing that, even if it is through the naming of her children. But I think the point you're drawing up here is a good one, is what do we do with these characters, and what is the message in all of this? Faye.
Just real briefly, two things. I love that book, Sarah. I think it's huge. The Red Tent. People haven't read it, they should read it. The other thing is the lesson I take from God loving these broken characters is that he can love us. Because I was raised Baptist and accepted Christ early, and I tried to be perfect. I mean, perfect. And now some of you guys probably think I am, so this might be a true confession. But when I fell short,
You're letting everyone down.
Sorry guys, I found comfort in God loving these broken people. And actually, I didn't murder anybody like Paul, and I never, or what David did, so I thought, boy, I stole a grape from the grocery store, and I'm not as bad as they are, and God can love me too. So I think that's what I take away from these patterns of God continuing to love very broken people.
Thanks. That's a great point, and I think a common one throughout Genesis and through other parts of the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well, as you point out with Paul. I think it's a challenge to us too, that religion transcends the moral, and that sometimes people that we consider immoral can have deeply intimate relationships with God, can be called by God in ways that are astounding. And oftentimes I think in Christian circles, sometimes we get too caught up in morality, and that separates us from spirituality or from religion, the depth of that. And I think y'all are all pointing this out with these characters and what that speaks to us as well. Also the element of, you can't judge a person in a singular moment, and that the arc of one's life is the true kind of display of one's character, of who one is. And so, if you take David in a singular moment, or Paul as he's persecuting Christians, and judge them on that moment, you're not seeing them as they truly are. And I think that speaks to the hope that we have too, that God is constantly at work within us, constantly calling us into deeper relationship with God and with our neighbor. Thanks, Faye. Who else has anything to add to this conversation, or any questions or reflections?
I would like to comment again, if I may,
Sure.
Will. Something that you've said a number of times that's real important is how you read these stories. You said that the stories are read at a level, and you could look at this like multiple levels in the story. That's what gives it complexity, because it doesn't solve it if you read it, just read the words. That's one way to do it. You can just read the words. And then people that read the words and thought about it, that person writes the Red Tent. I've never read that book, but that's where it would come from. She's reading it or doing it from a different level than the way we do it. So you always can run into stuff at the end that you didn't anticipate because of the way you read the story. So that's why it's interesting to do this, because if you think about it for a while, you can start to pick out these relationships and what's going on and why it is. And sometimes you can't figure it out. So that's why we have these Sunday school classes to help us do that. So your points about multiple levels are very important.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that's something I'm always astounded by, is just the complexity of these seemingly straightforward stories. A lot of these we learn as children, and are deeply ingrained in our kind of culture and upbringing. And I think we kind of almost keep them in that kind of at that level, and that's not bad. But as adults, I think we're called to bring a complexity to it and to see beyond the kind of black and white way we read a lot of these stories. And that's why I always say it's so important to read slow and to read multiple times and to hear the story as if for the first time. Because a lot of stuff we take on assumption, just assuming from what we've heard before or how we heard these stories when we were younger. This is a story I think is deeply complex and in a theological way, but you don't get that on a first reading. And you don't get that if someone said, what's the story of Rachel, Leah, and Jacob? Well, you say, oh, Laban tricked them, and that's it. And there's much more to it. But we've got a couple minutes left before we sign off. I want to ask, what's the theological message of this story? And does it have any relationship to God's appearance at the end of chapter 28 in the dream or the vision that Jacob had at Bethel? There's no right or wrong answer to this. There's no right or wrong answer to any of this, right? That's the work of us wrestling with all of this stuff and having conversations about it. But I was just curious if anything theological struck any of y'all.
Well,
yes, Dave.
I'm still stuck with this idea that Yahweh opened Leah's womb and why Jacob keeps going back to her. Does he go back to her because she's his slave and it's just he's married to her? Does he go back because the womb is open and he knows he's going to have children? And what is the message God is trying to give us? Is he trying to open her womb so that someone will love her, namely Jacob?
Yeah, so I think this is where God appears, right? Verse 31. And the point you're referencing is when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. There is no straightforward answer to this. I think your question about why does Jacob keep returning to her is that the way relationships worked in that day and age where women were property and their worth was in them having children. And so I think that's why Jacob's going to her. There's not the element of love that we hear at least twice with Rachel. And so I think that's the answer to that question. But the theological issue there is one I don't have an answer for. And I think it's really interesting is God is essentially going to the despised one, right? And it's interesting too, because it's the firstborn, which we've seen this is being overturned kind of routinely, and yet here God seems to favor the firstborn. And so is that because the firstborn in this case is the one that is despised, where in most cases the firstborn is the one that gets the birthright, that gets the blessing, that is lifted up as the kind of head of the family? And so I think you see this in the New Testament, specifically in the Gospels, with what liberation theologians call the preferential treatment of the poor. That this idea that Christ, as God incarnate, is going towards the poor intentionally because they are the ones that are despised or hated. They are the ones that are cast out, that are outcast, that are othered. And so I see that in a way with this, but I don't have a full answer to that question, but I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, it seems to be that the thing Yahweh is trying to induce is the missing element here, which is love. And it doesn't seem it's working. She has 4 or 5 kids and he still doesn't love them, apparently.
That's a really good point, Dave, is that God sees Leah. God sees Leah as unloved. And God goes and gives her birth. Or gives her, as it says, opened her womb. So she has these 4 children. And yet we know that Leah is still trying to kind of win the love of Jacob, or even just the attention. And I think that what you just pointed out is the complexity of this. There's the theological element of God going out, as Kelly points out, toward the unloved. And yet there's the human element of that doesn't change Jacob. how Jacob treats her. And that's the Bible, right? God's doing one thing and often humans are doing the opposite. That's a great place to leave it, and a great thing for us to think about. I'm going to pull up. All right, I'm changing our thing a little bit here. All right. Let us share together in our benediction. Are you ready? Oh, let us go from this place, remembering God's words to Jacob. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and the God of Leah. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Let us go from this place, proclaiming Jacob's words. Surely the Lord is in this place. Amen. All right. Thank y'all very much. I will see y'all next week, if not before. Take care. Peace.